When the call came from the Treasury Department and the White House to be Chief Counsel in 2017, I think was the first call for that. I would, on an almost weekly basis, have packages of regulations to implement this new law and the cross-border provisions of it that are hundreds of pages long with teams of, a dozen or more people working behind them. So I was very much drinking from a fire hose. The IRS touches more Americans than any other federal agency. 160 million tax returns are filed every year. So it really knows more about more Americans than probably any other federal agency. I went from TCJA enforcement and broader enforcement or TCJA implementation to what do we do about the pandemic? IRS ended up issuing 4 rounds of economic impact payment, billions of dollars going into tens of millions of Americans' bank accounts, and incredibly efficient in doing that. One path is to litigate that, but another path is to go in and knock on the door at the IRS and say, we've got this unsettled issue, but we don't want to litigate this. Can we get some guidance on that?
This is The Litigator's Edge, the podcast where smart strategy, practical innovation, and real-world experience come together to move litigation forward. Each week, we sit down with attorneys, legal tech leaders, and trusted advisors who are rethinking how great legal work gets done. You'll hear how law firms are building a competitive advantage. These conversations are grounded, insightful, and designed to help you refine how you work and how you win. Here is your host, Aniket Sawant.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of The Litigator's Edge, the podcast where innovative attorneys reveal the strategies that have transformed their legal practice. My name is Aniket Sawant, and I'm co-founder and CEO of Threadio. My guest today is one of the nation's preeminent tax attorneys who has shaped U.S. tax policy from within the highest levels of government and now guides clients through their most complex tax matters. Nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate, he previously served as the 48th Chief Counsel of the Internal Revenue Service, acting as the principal legal officer of the IRS. In this role, he oversaw nearly 1,500 lawyers and played a key role in landmark legislation like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act during a pivotal moment in our country's history. It's my pleasure to welcome Mike Desmond to the podcast. Welcome, Mike, and thank you for being here.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. As you know, Mike, we typically start with asking each of our guests to share either a fun fact about themselves or a cringe joke. Which will it be for you and what is it?
I will go with a fun fact. I tend to forget the punchline for cringe jokes. So let's go with a fun fact.
Sounds good.
And I will give a fun fact. I have run the Boston Marathon 16 times. So I'm looking forward to 17. So
amazing.
I'll come back to some of that. So yeah, fun fact there.
That's a lot. Wow. I mean, when did you start?
2000 was my first. So, and I haven't done every year since then, obviously, but 16 between 2000 and last year, 2024. So.
That is quite something. That's I'm a runner too, but nowhere near that. So I respect that a lot.
Yeah, a lot to run from, I tell people. So.
This is true.
Right.
Well, I think that's a great segue into my next question, which is I think of every attorney who makes the time to be on this podcast as a superhero, and every superhero has an origin story, and there's some very interesting facets to yours. Can you please share that with our audience?
Sure. I'd probably go back when I graduated from law school in 1994. I was fortunate enough to secure a clerkship with a district court judge in Los Angeles, Judge Ronald S.W. Wu, who recently passed. But probably one of the pivotal decisions I made wasn't a decision. It was really the fortune I had to clerk for Judge Wu. To do a clerkship coming out of law school, I'd moved from DC back to California, and Judge Wu immediately became a mentor for me, pushed me in the right direction of government service, returning to Washington, D.C., where I'd gone to law school, and joining the Justice Department. And again, was sort of instrumental in lining me up to meet with a number of his colleagues on the bench who'd been through the Justice Department, who'd started their careers in government service, and really give an enormous amount of credit to that kind of pivotal decision point. I had thought going to clerk that I would be taking the typical law firm route in Los Angeles. And had I done that, my life would be a completely different story at this point, my professional life in particular. So a lot of credit to Judge Wu, the judge I clerked for coming out of law school for just 1 year.
That's amazing. Yes, the power of mentors who can guide you in the right place and at the right times.
Yeah.
Let's dive a little bit deeper into that career in public service that you've had, which is truly distinguished. And obviously the crowning glory, in my view, was that you were the 48th Chief Counsel of the IRS. Sure. What was the common thread that drew you to the roles that you took in succession? And what was it like to be in that role with such tremendous responsibility?
Yeah, I think a couple of threads. I mean, one of them is just always being in a position, if the call comes, to be able to take a job in government service. And that's a combination of things. Your personal situation, you have to be, and I've been fortunate to have an incredibly supportive wife who has moved across the country with me 5 times over the course of my career for various opportunities I've had. So I think that has a lot to do with it, but really just being in a position both in life and professionally to take the call, both when I went to the Justice Department early in my career, when I went to the Treasury Department later in my career, and then, when the call came from the Treasury Department and the White House to be Chief Counsel in 2017, I think was the first call for that. So being positioned and being in a place in life where you can just sort of put your professional career on hold, have the support of clients and partners around you to take those jobs has been, I think, instrumental for me.
Amazing. Can you take us into the room, as it were, where you were IRS Chief Counsel? Specifically, there was a couple of monumental pieces of legislation that you had a key role in. Number one was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and number two was the COVID-19 relief packages. So, what did that look like? What was your role? How did it all come about? Please take us in.
Yeah, and I'll go back a little bit before that. So President Trump was first elected, as we know, in 2016, took office in 2017. At the end of 2017, so in December, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed into law. And I think it kind of took a lot of people by surprise that it happened then. There was an expectation it might not happen for a few more months, if, like any legislation, it happens at all. I was at that time still being vetted for the position as Chief Counsel. So there was nothing public. Certainly I was going to go in to the job, but I saw just from the outside, as I'm taking phone calls and speaking to folks at Treasury and at the White House, this major piece of tax legislation going forward. So my nomination was publicly announced in March of 2018. So that's 3 months after the legislation was passed into law. And at that point, I shut down my practice, or started to shut down my practice, knowing I was on a trajectory for hopefully for confirmation, although there's always some uncertainty around that. But I basically sat on the sidelines and watched this legislation, start to be implemented in 2018 as I was working my way through the Senate confirmation process. So I moved to DC in September of 2018, hoping that I would take the job very soon. And through the confirmation process and everything that's involved in that, it ended up getting delayed and delayed and delayed. And I didn't actually take office until March of 2019. So more than a year after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act had been signed into law. And at that point, there were dozens of moving projects that had been very well developed. And I've been watching them from the outside, but obviously didn't have any internal insight on them. So immediately hit the ground, and a lot of incredibly technical issues with a complete transformation of the way we tax cross-border businesses and activities in that 2017 legislation. So I would, on an almost weekly basis, have packages of regulations to implement this new law and the cross-border provisions of it that are hundreds of pages long, with teams of a dozen or more people working behind them. So I was very much drinking from a fire hose. I was fortunate to have incredibly competent people around me, my deputy Bill Paul, and the team, particularly in the international space and in the accounting space. So I had an enormous degree of trust and experience with the folks that have been doing all that work. So it was more for me kind of an informational, get up to speed on these projects. I was not taking the pen and writing 300 pages of regulations. But there are aspects of those that are controversial, and there would be required briefing to the secretary and the Assistant Secretary of Tax Policy. So there's quite a bit of work at the kind of higher level for some of the more difficult calls that had to be made in those guidance packages. But it was a very fast moving river. And I jumped into it a year and a half into it, not quite a year and a half into it. So it was an interesting experience. Great to be part of that. That's still kind of playing out with challenges to some of those regulations and litigation over that. So it was good to have a window on that. But that was my first year, basically, and the main focus of my first year as Chief Counsel.
That's amazing. For those of us who don't have the ringside view that you clearly did, and more than that, you had a sort of a decision-making view into this. For those of us who see sort of in the news, the legislation is passed and then it's implemented. Can you give us a few examples or a few nuances of what actually happens between a bill being signed with the ceremony and all of that, and actually implementing it into something that's workable and something that affects the American people?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there are a number of moving parts to that. I think a lot of the work behind the scenes at the IRS, both in the counsel's office and also on the what we call the client side, so the IRS, the function there that has to actually implement things, work is being done in advance of the passage of any legislation. to anticipate what's going to be needed, particularly, very significant legislation like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, so that people at least have identified potential projects and work streams that will need to be implemented once the legislation is signed into law. And so a key part of that is the regulations to implement the law, to interpret the law, other what we call sub-regulatory guidance, notices that are put out. But from the kind of generalist perspective, from the typical taxpayer's perspective, even sophisticated companies, they will see things like forms and instructions, like what do the 1040 instructions say? On the individual side, there are partners out there like the software companies, H&R Block, TurboTax, and the others that have to be making changes to their systems if they're going to start digesting new tax returns that have new tax provisions. There's a whole enforcement side of it. The IRS is looking at new laws. What are the potential areas of non-compliance? Are there potential areas for fraud or abuse of these statutes? How do we mitigate the risk around that? How do we put controls in place? So for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, there was a kind of landing team that was kind of pulling together all those resources, forms and publications, the enforcement side, the audit side, the IT function. How does the IRS digest new returns, electronically filed returns that have all these provisions? And then the counsel lawyers, like any other lawyer function, is advising the client there on all the legal aspects of it. Here's what the law means, those kinds of things. So it is, as you might imagine, a multifaceted framework and project on. And for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, there were hundreds of changes to the tax law. So it's hundreds of kind of moving streams that are all being coordinated together.
Makes sense. Thank you for sharing that. In addition to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, you were also involved in the COVID-19 relief packages. Can you maybe give us a sense of what happened there, and obviously the sensitivity around a public health crisis, which is very different from what was happening, in 2017, 2018?
Yeah. And this is something that I had focused on, prior in my career as well, but it sort of helped to highlight how ubiquitous the tax law is, because people don't necessarily think of the tax law. It's like, all right, it's just revenue agents and revenue officers out there. You file tax returns, you pay taxes, the taxes get collected, you get audited. But there are hundreds of provisions in the tax law that deliver benefits: earned income tax credits, renewable energy credits, accelerated depreciation, things like that incentivize various economic behavior. The deduction for mortgage interest expense on your home incentivizes home purchases. So there's this whole rubric of tax incentives. And historically, when there have been natural disasters, Hurricane Katrina being an example of one that I dealt with earlier in my career, or the COVID-19 pandemic, Congress has historically leaned on the IRS to help implement relief packages there. In part because the IRS touches more Americans than any other federal agency. 160 million tax returns are filed every year. So it really touches more Americans and has the ability to touch and knows more about, more Americans than probably any other federal agency. Social Security is broad, but the beneficiaries are just retirees. Almost everybody files tax returns, although there is a large constituency of people that don't, which was another issue in the COVID-19. So I think when the pandemic hit in March of 2020, the IRS was looking at like everybody else. And I remember a few kind of sleepless weekends where things were happening, one-off infections, and somebody went to some, wedding in New York that came back to an office, and what do we do about it? But I think there was a general consensus, it's going to be a couple of weeks. So we're going to have to take care of our people for a couple of weeks, but we'll all be back. And that was certainly the policy view, and what Congress was thinking. There's going to be the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act was the first legislation that was passed in March of 2020. That was thought to be kind of the short term, like let's get sick leave out there and sick leave credits and family leave credits out there. And then that evolved, obviously, and it wasn't a couple of weeks. It was, a couple of years. So there were a lot of things like the legislative relief, but also just, running an organization. At least counsel was only 2,000 people, 1,500 lawyers. IRS had 100,000 people, processing returns and a much more manual function. And so we were trying to work with the client there as well, labor relations issues, OSHA issues with safety, and the counsel was trying to advise the client there on those fronts as well. But it flipped my job upside down. I went from kind of TCJ enforcement and, some broader enforcement or TCJ implementation to what do we do about the pandemic? So
another monumental effort that was also time sensitive and fast moving. So.
Yeah. And obviously people's lives were at stake. And then the economic relief too. The IRS ended up issuing 4 rounds of economic impact payment, billions of dollars going into tens of millions of Americans' bank accounts, and incredibly efficient in doing that, notwithstanding a few hiccups along the way with checks being sent out to dead people and those kinds of things. But it was a very interesting time and a complete unexpected, obviously, exercise
Absolutely.
going in there. So
No,
yeah,
that was remarkable. Again, kudos to you
yeah,
for driving through
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Um, uh, we call this podcast, Mike, the Litigator's Edge, and so we focus a lot on litigators. But how, in your opinion, would you say the mindset of a litigator who is focused on the facts of a specific case, narrow in its scope, and so on and so forth, differ from the mindset of a policy advisor, such as one in your position and your position in the IRS, where you basically have an impact on almost every American's life? What is the difference in mindset, and how does one sort of, in your career, how do you think that being in this policy advising role has helped you essentially become a better attorney overall?
Sure. I think it's given me a broader perspective, and I hold myself out now as a tax controversy lawyer, and a part of that is litigation. And so I'll litigate cases in the tax court and the district courts up into the courts of appeals. But I think tax controversy is broader, and it really starts with enactment of new legislation. And there's going to be some uncertainty as to how a statute applies to a particular taxpayer. And there are lots of ways to approach that. You can decide that you're going to litigate that issue. You're going to file a tax return. The IRS is going to disagree with it, and that goes off on the path toward litigation in tax court. Or you can take a more collaborative approach to that. There's this uncertainty here. We think this is the right answer. And so you can work with stakeholders and colleagues at Treasury and the IRS to kind of come up with, let's get a rule on this. Let's see if we can get a regulation or a change to a regulation that will interpret this. Work with Congress to get a technical correction to something. So I think in that respect, there's a lot of kind of common ground between the policy function and the litigation function. In the tax world, it's all oriented toward getting answers to uncertain tax questions. And litigation can be a very important tool in doing that. But there are alternatives in the lead up. And I always think kind of pragmatically about things. Clients, with a few exceptions, most clients don't relish the prospect of litigating against the IRS in tax court or in district court. So is there a path to resolving this uncertain tax question, short of that? And if not, we litigate cases, but it's all about looking toward a path to resolution. And one of the things that's always attracted me, and even when I went to the Justice Department right out of my clerkship, to tax is I've always thought of it's a more somewhat civilized litigation practice. It's not like divorce law or family law, and they have their own pluses and minuses, I'm sure, but in my experience, having been on both sides of even litigating cases in the tax world, there is this kind of collective understanding that you're just trying to find the right interpretation of an uncertain position or an uncertain provision in the tax law. So it can be a more kind of collaborative process. It's not anything that I take personally or that the government tends to take personally. And I see that in other areas of litigation where this is all about a personal dispute, and litigation is just a vehicle for airing that. You see a little bit of that in tax, and that does sometimes happen, but for the most part, it's working with your counterparts at the IRS and the Justice Department to try to find the right answer in a case.
Makes a lot of sense. You may have answered this question already through what you just shared, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is that you've been on both sides, which is tremendous, and that gives you a unique perspective. For those attorneys who have not been on both sides, who've mainly been in private practice, what would you say is the biggest misconception that such attorneys might have about how the Office of the Counsel operates?
Perhaps like a conception that this is all heavily coordinated. A lot of clients think like, if I'm being audited, it's like, I think some people think the world sort of like revolves around them, and it's actually not as coordinated as you would think it would be. I mean, there are some efforts at the IRS to make sure, and there are very formal procedures for like designating cases for litigation to select one. But aside from those, there is some base level of coordination, but a lot of what happens in audits and in litigation is almost by accident. There are reasons why a particular taxpayer was selected for audit. It's some random statistical scoring that got their return selected for audit. So I think there's a lot more randomness in the controversy area than people assume. There's got to be a reason why I was selected, And sometimes there is. I mean, there can be like whistleblowers, your ex-girlfriend dropped a dime on you and told the IRS that you were cheating on your taxes. And that can certainly be the cause of some things. But for the most part, it's a lot more random than that. And there isn't this kind of coordinated effort to, focus on individual taxpayers. It's some people just for whatever reason get caught up and they're the test case for something. It's never a fun position for a client to be in, to explain to them you are the test case for a particular issue. and need to commit the resources to defending your position on that. But I think a lot more randomness than people sometimes assume.
Right. And that sort of underscores what you said in previously, which is that it's not personal. It just, whether it's random or whether it happens just by happenstance, that's just how it happened. And there's nothing personal about it, but you just have to get through it.
Yeah. And folks do get caught up. Taxpayers do get caught up. There are people at the IRS who have very dedicated positions on particular issues. They just don't like they think a provision or a credit is subject to potential abuse. They take very kind of scripted, very strict interpretations of things. And there's a mindset there that I was always, at Chief Counsel trying to back people off of, particularly as the number of like what we call tax expenditure provisions where Congress is intending to just give money away, and intending incentives to be provided there, credits and deductions and other things. And it's sometimes counterintuitive that the IRS will take a very strict position on that. We're not going to give the research credit to somebody. We're going to take a very strict position on that, even though Congress intended there to be incentive provided to incentivize research. So that said, I'm not saying that there aren't people that kind of roll up their sleeves and take very, some might say aggressive positions internally to deny or try to deny a particular benefit. That does happen. But, it's not like you would see in other areas of law where it's something personal driving that I'm going to pick Mike Desmond out of a hat, just deny him the research credit. It's more, perhaps misplaced sometimes, but policy-based on some level.
Yep. Thank you for sharing that. One interesting nuance in what you just shared, Mike, is the intent. So it sounds like there's almost like a balancing act between, for the IRS, between obviously, conducting its enforcement and oversight duties and also ensuring that Congress's intent comes through.
Absolutely.
In how you perform.
Yeah, and in particular in tax expenditure provisions where it really is, and the IRS has challenges there, and being given this dual mission. On the one hand, to collect $5 trillion in revenue every year. On the other hand, to give out several $1 trillion in tax benefits. I analogize it to being both the accounts payable and the accounts receivable function at a company. And there is a little bipolarness going on there with the IRS sometimes. Which hat are we supposed to be wearing?
Makes sense. Mike, so what was it transitioning from the, essentially what I would say is, the pinnacle of government service back to private practice? Can you walk us through sort of what your post-IRS journey has been like?
Yeah, I was only in the position for a couple of years and had hoped that it would have gone longer. There was a lot of work left to be done. It is a lot of work left to be done at the IRS. So I was disappointed that my tenure didn't go longer, and the position sat vacant actually for a number of months, I think even a couple of years after I left. So, for me, and as you recall, the election of 2020 was contested and there was a lot of noise around that. And so there was some uncertainty in like November, December, January, and certainly in October, like, would I have a job? And it was very unusual for me at the IRS. The IRS is 100,000 people. There are two political appointees. There's the Chief Counsel, the role I had, and the Commissioner. Commissioner has a 5-year term. So my client, the Commissioner of the IRS, Chuck Rettig, was going to stay on after the election because his term went through. I think it had at least another year left on his term, maybe longer. So I was the one person in the agency who, if the administration changed, would lose their job. And other agencies, the Small Business Administration and others, have dozens of political appointees, so you're in good company there. So it was this, and we were in the middle of still trying to implement all sorts of, COVID relief provisions. I didn't have a whole lot of time to commit to the political speculation on where the elections would go and those kinds of things. But it was very kind of uncertain for me personally to be in this organization of 100,000 people as the only one person who's going to lose their job if the administration changes, likely to lose their job. So I kind of was in denial there all the way through January of 2021 and did make some pitch. And, when the Biden administration came in, I worked very closely with the transition team to try to make sure that the incoming folks in the transition team would know what we're working on and make sure there was no hiccup there in getting the COVID relief and other things. But I kind of held on until the last minute to see, well, maybe this will continue and they'll decide that there's some role for me even on an interim basis. And just never got a call. So, I was living in an apartment down on Pennsylvania Avenue with a view of the Capitol. And so on January 20th, I went up to the roof and watched President Biden get sworn in from the roof and said, well, I guess my job's over. I had submitted previously a resignation letter, as all political appointees are expected to do, saying as of noon on January 20th, I hereby resign, subject to any sort of exception if you want to keep me on. And that resignation letter became effective on noon. So, At 12:01, I was sitting there unemployed. I turned off my computer since I shouldn't be accessing return information anymore, anything confidential, and had to decide on next steps. So, but it was still in the middle of the pandemic. Vaccines were just on the cusp, so it was a very strange time. You couldn't just go out and do whatever you wanted to do. But my wife and I had to decide, and we were going to move back to California. We kept our home here in Santa Barbara throughout that time, so we knew we'd move back to California. Just had to decide on what would be next.
Makes sense. So, what do you focus on today in your private practice since 1201 on January 2021 through today?
Yeah. Well, I left. So I left Chief Counsel in January of 2021, and then actually went to Hawaii for a month and a half in the middle of the pandemic, and just got a townhouse on Kauai, and spent a month or so there just doing virtual interviews and deciding what I wanted to do. So I hadn't made any effort toward next steps and didn't want to do that while I was still in the position. So I got a lot of calls and a lot of contacts in the legal field, obviously. And then decided ultimately to go to Gibson Dunn, big litigation firm. A significant part of that, Gibson Dunn is a very storied firm, incredibly well-respected firm, big litigation firm, big footprint in California. I wanted to move back to California, but also had a nice presence in DC and New York, and had some, good friends and colleagues. Eric Sloan was heading up the tax group then, and made a big push to bring me in and expand the tax practice there. So it's great to land, and I kind of got to Gibson Dunn in the downtown LA office in, I guess, May of 2021. And at the time, if you remember, in California, Governor Newsom was a governor. We're going to open up California in June of 2021. We got the vaccines. Everything's going to be wide open. I said, well, this would be great. I'm in this new office here. And that ended up not happening. So there were a few kind of like hiccups there in starting a new practice, and ended up having a great experience at Gibson. It's a fantastic firm. It's everything I knew it to be. But my practice then and now is much more diverse. I mean, I've got clients that range from individuals to the, Fortune 10 companies. And it was, I think, Gibson more in the litigation function and even the tax function has very large clients with very large projects. I have a much more diverse practice where I've got some large clients, but on smaller matters. And so I ended up earlier this year moving to Miller and Chevalier, my current firm, which I've known for decades, just because it's the boutique practice. It's a very flexible platform for me. I don't have the very large firm. I don't have the conflicts issues. I can have the flexibility to do one-off cases on interesting issues for individual clients, and large cases with a team of associates on the largest corporate audits and litigation matters. But it's the tax community and the tax controversy community is a very close-knit group. I work with a lot of other firms as co-counsel. So it's a very kind of cohesive, collaborative practice amongst all folks in the tax controversy area. And my competitors, I also consider to be my good friends. And so we work very collaboratively together. And I found a little bit better platform for that at Miller and Chevalier, all of which is kind of a long-winded answer to your question, like, what did I do when I left counsel in 21?
No, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. It's interesting that you have a diversity of clients ranging from, as you mentioned, individuals all the way to Fortune 10 clients. What do you see as the role of technology, or what role has technology, including AI, played in terms of the matters that you represent these clients in on the one side, and then also in terms of how you conduct your legal practice on the other?
Yeah, I think it has certainly driven the mix. I mean, some of my practice now, a corner of my practice is representing clients in the digital asset space, which I didn't do any of. I mean, I had a little exposure to it when I was at the Chief Counsel's office, but since then I've kind of expanded that. So I have a number of clients that are more institutional clients in the space, decentralized finance protocols and other kind of entities that are in that digital asset space. That has, for me, been a substantive learning curve over the last 4 years, to try to understand what, I guess for everyone it has been, what that industry is, what the technology is. So that has absolutely driven a change in my practice as I start taking on those client relationships. And some of that is more on the front end of things. That's a new industry, new clients. So most tax litigation and audits are years in arrears. You're dealing with something that's 3, 5, 10 or more years behind. So you don't see cutting edge technological issues in the litigation and audit context. But you do see it in the context of, like, there's this uncertainty around what do we do with staking rewards? How do we tax that? And one path is to litigate that, but another path is to go in and knock on the door at the IRS and say, we've got this unsettled issue. We don't want to litigate this. Can we get some guidance on that? Emerging technologies like that have certainly played a role in that aspect of my practice, while at the same time I got clients that have audits and litigation years that are 10 plus years old. So it's been an interesting complement as I kind of look at those emerging technologies.
And what sort of emerging technologies, including AI, although not necessarily just that, do you use in your practice, if any?
I use some. I mean, though on a personal level, I think the ones I deploy are more just research tools, like a lot of us do. And those are, I think, for many of us, relatively new. We've got kind of firm training that we do on all that to make sure that we're using those tools correctly. And we've all seen the headlines about people, having AI briefs written and the consequences of that. So you need to be a little careful around that. I'm probably behind the curve on implementing even research tools that are AI based. In part because of where I am in the position in my career. I tend to have or hope to have, teams of associates that are doing the basic level research and maybe even, senior associates and counsel lawyers between them. So it's unusual for me to be the one doing the base level research on something that needs that kind of AI assisted. I mean, I know my way around, but I don't utilize that to a significant degree. And that's just on kind of like the nuts and bolts of the practice of law and research and developing positions. And then obviously on the fact development side, we work with a lot of litigation support companies, that are digesting and it's amazing to see from early in my career where, document production was this very manual process. I think there are very few associates today that have the recollection of being sent to warehouses in Boston and Minneapolis in January to start reviewing documents and, Sharpies to redact privileged information. So going from that to where we are today with the AI tools and technology that allows data to be digested and searched for responsive materials and redacted for privileged information. I see that, but I'm not on the front lines sending associates to warehouses or to deploy them. I kind of have management role on that, but I'm not the one actually working on the AI tools. But I do see them being deployed in incredible efficiencies compared to what we used to do on a manual process to have lawyers reviewing documents and fact development.
I'm sure those associates appreciate you're not sending them.
I think so. Yeah. It used to be a lot of billable hours, but it was certainly not the most efficient thing for the client. So yeah.
Taking a step back, Mike, you've talked about sort of the past and where things are today. In terms of the work that you do, what do you see as the next major area of tax controversy? International tax issues, the digital economy, some of the crypto items that you mentioned, enforcement, or something else. What's your general view on things?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is resource driven, and things have really changed dramatically over the last 6 months or so at the IRS. The IRS got a very significant slug of funding for enforcement in the Inflation Reduction Act back in 2022, I think it was. And billions of dollars in additional funding, $60 billion against a baseline budget of about $14 billion a year in the total budget for the IRS. So for a number of years there, a couple of years, there was this significant ramp up in enforcement at the IRS. And we started to see an emergence of audits of partnerships, an area that hasn't been focused on as a kind of IRS audit litigation enforcement area. So there was a ramp up there. And that's all kind of changed in the recent environment. There's been a curtailment of resources at the IRS across the federal government, more generally. And that I think is causing a more concentrated focus for the IRS on where their enforcement resources should be deployed. So I think it's going to go back to some of the more basic issues. Transfer pricing, which is cross-border companies, has always been a focus. A lot of big dollar issues that will continue to be a focus. I think there will be an effort, to your earlier question about AI and deploying AI to find, and the IRS has been putting tools in place to do that, to find the right focus of its enforcement resources. And I think some of that, and where that goes, it's a little unclear. Is it going to be big corporations? Is it going to be partnerships? Is it going to be individuals? Is it going to be high net worth people? Is it going to be, lower income taxpayers with earned income tax credit that there's been a historic, non-compliance area? But I'm optimistic that there will be, kind of an AI-led better focus on, because the worst thing for both the taxpayers and the IRS is to commit resources to a full-blown audit that takes months, if not years, to conclude, and ends up being no adjustment at the end of the day, or a very minor adjustment. So I think, and historically, that's been a problem for the IRS, particularly like in partnership tax returns. they audit the partnership tax return. They spend months and months and years and countless man hours. And then at the end of the day, there's no adjustment and no additional tax due. So can we better focus those resources and use, new technology to do that? And that, I think, is probably going to be the open question. And where that gets focused, I think is well, we'll find out, where those tools point us. But that, I think, would be something to look for in this more resource constrained environment.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Well, Mike, this has been a great conversation. Just a couple of quick questions to close us out.
Sure.
For professionals who want to understand not just what the tax law is, but how they can keep on top of tax policy and the legislative process in Washington, are there one or two resources that you recommend? Maybe a book, a website, or other resource?
Yeah, I mean, I think what most tax lawyers do, that we have our trade press, which is really fantastic. So both Bloomberg and Tax Notes in particular, I think, is a go-to resource for being on the West Coast. It's great because it's published at 10 o'clock at night, my time, so I can read, what's coming out the next day. Law 360, there's some really good trade press, and Bloomberg's probably more widely available to folks outside of tax. But those are great resources just to find out what's going on. Not necessarily reading the hundreds of pages of regulations, but just the headlines in there. What are the cases that are being brought? Also, the tax court's website is quite robust just to see, they'll post their most recent decisions every day. So if somebody's interested in tax, go and see what decisions have been issued this week by the tax court, what areas they're in. Read just the summaries of them, and it gives you a sense of what kind of issues. Some really fascinating types of cases coming out of the tax court. They aren't all dry green eye shade stuff. So that's an interesting read and a very accessible resource as well that I would point people toward.
Thank you for sharing that. If I now ask you to give advice to an attorney just coming out of law school, thinking about what's ahead of them in their career, and they're looking at sort of the technology landscape, the societal landscape, thinking about whether they should go into public service or into private practice, similar to a decision that you had to make many, many years ago, what would be the advice that you would give?
Yeah, I would always say, if you have the opportunity, then find a role. If it's not, first job in your career, at some point in your career, find a role in government, whether that's your local district attorney's office, even your local public defenders or the Justice Department. And now, in a time of sort of curtailment of hiring, it's a little more challenging to find those positions, but they're still there. And it's really a great way to start your career. And I think it's actually the earlier you do that, the better. Some of the best advice I got at the Justice Department was after being, 5 years there and 6 years out of law school, start to look for a position in private practice, because you can't really move into private practice having been 15 years in government, because partnership track is 8 to 10 years. And so the earlier in your career you can do that, I think the better. And it's very challenging now with, student loan debts, and, the big firms are offering significant salaries that are orders of magnitude greater than what public service is paying. But I don't think anybody looks back, having spent 4 or 5 years in public service, coming right out of law school or clerkship, and has any regrets whatsoever on that. And I'm certainly count myself among that.
Final question for you, Mike. Is there a question that I should have asked you, but I didn't?
I don't know what my marathon time is.
Yes, please. please do share that.
No, I say that somewhat in jest, but I come back to that, and it's not a question you should have asked, but I do have a very kind of pragmatic view of the law. I always say my clients have better things to do than to deal with me in a tax controversy matter. So if there's a way I can get out of it, and some of that is just because I have other interests in life. I would, rather be running a marathon than in tax court litigating a case. So is there a way we can avoid going to court? Is there a way we can get this matter settled? So I think all of us in the tax world would love to see something that makes our jobs go away so that our clients can focus on the business and actually building things and making money. And what I do is kind of the defensive stuff on the back end. I'm the problem in most of my clients' life. So very pragmatic view of things. And that gets back to the marathon time. So the lower the marathon time, the better. That means you've got time to do things other than, try cases in tax court, which, as I said, clients will do if they have to, but there are better solutions to most disputes that we can find out there.
Amazing. Well, on that note, Mike, thank you so much for your time, your insights, and for sharing everything that you did. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I thought it was a privilege, and I'm sure our audience will as well.
Yeah,
so thank you.
Yeah. Love your podcast. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a great opportunity for me.
The Litigator's Edge podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.